Inside Australia's most extreme prisons. Secrets of Goulburn Supermax and Barwon. This documentary-style narrative explores two of Australia's highest security prisons, Goulburn Supermax in New South Wales and Barwon Prison in Victoria. Both facilities house some of the country's most violent and high-risk offenders, including convicted murderers, gang leaders, terrorists, and inmates considered so dangerous they cannot mix with the general prison population. The story examines real public information about their design, daily operations, and high-profile cases tied to them, blending dramatized elements for immersion while grounding every factual claim in news reports, court filings, and official corrections sources. The prison Australia built to fear. They say Australia is a country defined by wide open space, endless coastlines, sweeping deserts, and cities where life is built on sunshine and a certain quiet confidence. But tucked away far from the surf beaches and high-rise skylines is another world entirely. A world sealed behind reinforced steel, 22-hour lockdowns, motion sensors, airlock doors, and corridors patrolled with the kind of controlled tension you can feel in your teeth. A world designed for one purpose: to hold the men the government believes must never be allowed to walk among the public again. And if you look up the official language used to describe one of these places, New South Wales Goulburn Correctional Centre's High Risk Management Unit, better known simply as Goulburn Supermax, you'll find the same phrase repeated across news reports, oversight documents, and court statements. Australia's most secure prison. But locals in the town of Goulburn, they phrase it a little differently. They call it the Tomb. The nickname didn't come from the architecture. It didn't come from the color of the cement. It came from what happens once that final steel door closes: the silence, the isolation, the sensory deprivation that multiple studies and correctional watchdogs have criticized. It came from the fact that in this place, according to public corrections protocols, some inmates are cut off from human contact so severely that their only conversations come through intercom speakers. And that's where our story begins. Not with the inmates themselves, but with the walls. Because in Goulburn Supermax, even the walls have a reputation. At dawn, the fog settles low across the southern tablelands. The grass around the perimeter fence beads with drops of cold moisture, and the kangaroos grazing on the far ridge pay no attention to the prison looming in the distance. There's nothing unusual here, until you notice the faint electrical hum carried on the wind. The hum is the perimeter alarm system, backed by pressure pads, microwave barriers, CCTV arrays, and layers of fencing topped with razor wire. According to publicly available NSW corrections documents, the Supermax section is engineered so that no single point of failure can compromise security. If one alarm goes down, another replaces it. If one door fails, another door further down the corridor remains sealed. But the truth is even more unsettling. The real security isn't the fence. It's the design of the entire building, a honeycomb of airlocked compartments that isolate sound, movement, and even airflow. The idea, reported in multiple Australian news investigations, was to create a place where escape is physically impossible, because each inmate is surrounded by constraint at every layer. Not just physically, but psychologically. And that element of psychological pressure, it's intentional. According to multiple human rights observers and correctional assessments, the architecture is designed to keep inmates compliant by reducing their ability to coordinate, communicate, or influence anything beyond their own cell door. Which brings us to the first cell of the morning. The cell looks deceptively simple. A bed bolted to the floor. A stainless steel toilet built into the wall. A window made of fortified glass the thickness of a man's fist. According to reports from correctional staff and official inspections, every item inside has been selected for one reason only: it cannot be weaponized. Even the toothbrush is flexible, a pale bendable strip that would buckle before it pierced skin. But the most important part of the cell is invisible. It's the air. The ventilation system in Goulburn Supermax, according to facilities documents obtained through news outlets, is designed so that inmates cannot shout to each other through vents. The airflow moves in isolated channels, sealed from unit to unit. Conversations simply disappear into metal, swallowed before they can travel. Every sound is monitored. Every movement is recorded. And every inmate is watched. But even a prison built to contain the most dangerous people in the country doesn't stay quiet forever. Sometimes, the silence breaks. Across the compound, the morning shift begins. Correctional officers, trained specifically for high-risk management, walk in pairs. Not because it's a rule, but because it's a necessity. Officers assigned to the Supermax are required to undergo additional training, according to department guidelines, to prepare them for inmates with histories of escape attempts, extreme violence, or affiliations with major criminal networks. Some of the inmates here are convicted terrorists. Some are gang leaders or contract killers. Some were transferred after violent incidents in other prisons. The identities vary, the crimes differ, but the classification is the same: extreme high risk. And every officer knows the weight of that classification. One mistake can cost a life. But the officers also know something else, something not written in any official manual. The most dangerous moments in the Supermax aren't the confrontations. They're the quiet times. The times when a man sits alone, locked away for 22 or even 23 hours a day, and begins to think. To plan. To remember. To resent. Solitary confinement has that effect. According to human rights organizations and academic studies, long-term isolation can change a person. It can fuel paranoia. It can sharpen grudges. It can turn time itself into a weapon. And some of the men in Goulburn have nothing left to lose. That's one side of our story. The other begins 700 kilometers away, in the state of Victoria. Barwon Prison. If Goulburn is the fortress built to crush momentum, Barwon is the fortress built to contain power. Opened in 1990 and repeatedly upgraded, with publicly reported security enhancements after multiple high-profile incidents, Barwon has earned a reputation equal parts fear, legend, and cold practicality. It houses some of Australia's most notorious offenders, including those involved in gangland killings, large-scale organized crime, and complex criminal networks that once stretched across cities. Unlike Goulburn's more monolithic isolation model, Barwon is built like a layered kingdom, multiple units, each with their own culture, their own tensions, their own history of alliances and betrayals. And its most secure section. Unit 13. According to public reports, Unit 13 is the high-security management unit, similar in purpose to Goulburn's Supermax wing. Inmates placed there aren't just dangerous, they're volatile. They're the ones with histories of assaults, plots, or intelligence flags that trigger immediate isolation. But you don't understand Barwon until you stand inside its walls. Until you hear the metallic echo that seems to follow every step. Until you walk past a cell door and feel that someone unseen is watching through the narrow reinforced slit. Until you realize that the tension in the air isn't just from the inmates. It's from the staff. Because in Barwon, the staff carry the memories of incidents that still haunt the facility. According to news reports over the years, Barwon has faced riots, hostage situations, assaults, and security alerts serious enough to temporarily shut down entire units. Barwon is a place shaped by confrontation. Goulburn is a place shaped by containment. Together, they form the twin pillars of Australia's extreme security system, a system few people know much about, because the inside of these walls is a world intentionally sealed from the public. But today, we're stepping inside. Not to sensationalize. Not to fearmonger. But to understand. Because behind the layers of concrete and razor wire lies one essential truth. A maximum security prison tells you less about the inmates, and more about the society that built it. To understand why these places exist, you need to go back to the late 1990s and early 2000s. An era when Australia experienced several major criminal events that reshaped the national conversation about security, terrorism, and organized crime. These events, according to public records and media coverage, pressured governments to rethink how the justice system could handle offenders who remained dangerous long after their sentencing. Goulburn Supermax was officially opened in 2001. It was built because the state needed a facility where the most violent or ideologically motivated offenders could be securely isolated from the general prison population. Its design was heavily influenced by international models, including U.S. Supermax facilities, though adapted for Australian legal standards and oversight. Barwon's transformation into a high-security heavyweight happened gradually. The prison already housed serious offenders, but as Victoria's criminal landscape intensified, especially during the era of gangland killings reported extensively in the press, the need for tighter control grew. By the mid-2000s, Barwon had become synonymous with organized crime containment. But high security comes with high cost, political, financial, and moral. And that's where our story takes its first turn. Because you cannot build a place designed to isolate human beings for years without consequences. You cannot lock a man in a cell 22 hours a day without raising questions. You cannot turn a facility into a fortress without wondering what, exactly, you fear will break out. Some corrections officers say the strictness is essential, that without these measures, lives would be lost. Their argument, recorded in interviews and public statements, is simple: we're not dealing with ordinary criminals. These are individuals who have committed extreme acts of violence or who have the capacity to orchestrate violence even from behind bars. But critics, advocacy groups, psychologists, legal scholars, argue that indefinite high-security isolation can border on cruel and unusual punishment. Some point to the United Nations guidelines on solitary confinement. Others cite cases where inmates deteriorated mentally. And somewhere between these two opposing sides lies the reality. A reality that both Goulburn and Barwon embody like mirror images. A reality where safety and darkness coexist in equal measure. Our first deeper step into that reality begins with a man we'll call Daniel, a pseudonym. His identity is based on a composite of publicly documented inmate cases. No real private individual is being represented here. Daniel arrived at Goulburn Supermax after an assault at another prison. According to public descriptions of similar cases in Australian corrections history, inmates transferred to Supermax often have a pattern: sudden violence, deliberate planning, or a demonstrated ability to manipulate or intimidate others. Daniel was all three. When he stepped off the transport vehicle, he didn't look around. Didn't blink at the 1,000-pound steel doors. Didn't react to the officer's body armor or the way they formed a tight formation around him. He moved with a calmness that officers would later describe as unsettling. But the real story wasn't Daniel's arrival. It was what he carried with him: knowledge, influence, loyalty from men who weren't inside the walls, but outside them. And that's what Goulburn Supermax was designed to crush. Not the men. The influence. According to court filings and security assessments available in the public domain, inmates with connections to organized crime groups pose a unique challenge. They don't need physical contact to exert power. They communicate with coded messages. They send signals through lawyers, through visits, through any crack in the system they can find. Goulburn's purpose is to close those cracks. Which is why Daniel's first week was a wall of silence. No phone calls without monitoring. No contact visits. No yard time with others. Every movement escorted. Every action documented. Every interaction controlled. For the first time in years, Daniel lost control. And in a place like Goulburn, losing control doesn't just break a man. It reshapes him. Contrast that with Barwon Prison, where power doesn't vanish into the walls, it shifts into new shapes. Barwon is not isolation in the same extreme form. It has multiple units, yards, workshops, and internal hierarchies. And in these complex structures, influence doesn't disappear. It adapts. Barwon is the kind of place where an inmate's reputation enters the building before he does. Stories circulate. Cases from news archives are whispered through cell doors. Officers keep mental lists of who aligns with who, because a peaceful unit can turn volatile if the wrong two men end up in neighboring cells. According to public reporting on the Victorian corrections system, Barwon's high-security units often house inmates with links to complex criminal networks. These networks don't evaporate upon incarceration. They evolve, sometimes becoming more dangerous because they are less visible. One former officer, speaking to media anonymously, described Barwon's tension like this: "You don't fear the loud ones. You fear the quiet ones, the ones planning." And it's that planning that has shaped the prison's history. Barwon has seen escapes plotted, attempted smuggling operations, coded communications, and power struggles that required entire units to be locked down. Where Goulburn is silence, Barwon is pressure. Where Goulburn crushes communication, Barwon monitors it. Where Goulburn tries to stop influence, Barwon tries to contain it. Two different prisons. One shared purpose: to hold the men considered too dangerous to hold anywhere else. But the question that drives this documentary isn't simply how these prisons operate. It's why. Why does a country with a relatively small prison population build institutions of such extreme intensity? Why design places meant not just to confine, but to control? Why place so much emphasis on locking down a handful of individuals? The answer comes from a statement made years ago by an NSW official, quoted in news coverage about the Supermax's role. Some offenders remain a threat even behind bars. Threats to the public. Threats to the staff. Threats to other inmates. Threats that do not end with sentencing. Threats that must be neutralized. And whether you agree with how that neutrality is achieved, that's up to you. But one fact is certain. Both Goulburn Supermax and Barwon Prison were designed with the same unavoidable calculation. There are some men we cannot risk. And in Chapter 2, we step into the stories of those men. The ones whose histories shaped these prisons into what they are today. The ones whose presence turned walls into fortresses. The ones whose crimes still echo through courtrooms, headlines, and public memory. The ones who forced Australia to confront the darkest corners of its criminal landscape. And respond with steel, silence, and absolute control. The men who shaped the walls. Before you can understand a maximum security prison, you must understand the men who forced it into existence. Because these prisons, Goulburn Supermax in New South Wales and Barwon Prison in Victoria, were not built in a vacuum. They were shaped by histories of violence, extremist ideology, organized crime, and moments that left both governments and corrections staff shaken. Each inmate, each case, left a scar on the architecture. A blind spot closed. A protocol rewritten. A door reinforced. A single act of violence in one decade would lead to a construction project in the next. And so, if Chapter 1 was about the walls, Chapter 2 is about the men who taught Australia why those walls had to be built the way they were. The men who turned steel into a language of necessity. The men whose crimes became defining events. And the men whose presence inside the system continues to shape how Australia thinks about punishment, safety, and the dark spaces where both collide. The first story begins long before Goulburn Supermax was even constructed. It begins in the late 1990s, with a wave of high-profile offenders the system struggled to contain. One of them was a man we'll call the Mastermind. A pseudonym representing a composite of several well-documented offenders whose cases appear in court records and media reports. He wasn't just violent, he was strategic. He had connections outside prison walls. He had followers. And most importantly, he had patience. Before Supermax existed, he served time in regular maximum security units. And in those units, according to archived reporting, he was always 2 steps ahead. He coordinated conflicts. Passed coded messages. Moved influence like a chess player inching pieces into place. He wasn't the only one. During this period, Australia saw spikes in gang-related violence, organized criminal operations, and a growing realization that some offenders were more dangerous after incarceration than before. These were not men who simply sat in a cell and waited for time to pass. These were men who understood that crime doesn't end with handcuffs. And the existing system was overwhelmed. Multiple reports from that era, parliamentary reviews, inquiries, investigative journalism, describe the same problem. Certain inmates could not be safely housed in general population. They manipulated others. They orchestrated attacks. They threatened witnesses and victims' families. They established internal hierarchies so strong that officers struggled to intervene. The system needed a solution. Something airtight. Something absolute. Something that no human willpower could outmaneuver. And so the conversations began. At first quietly, then urgently. A new facility was needed. Not a prison, but a vault. A place where Australia's highest-risk inmates could be placed beyond the reach of influence. Where connection itself would be severed. The idea of Goulburn Supermax took shape. And it would be built for men like the Mastermind. But the story of a security fortress isn't complete without the story of a man who tried to breach it. Enter the soldier. Another composite of multiple publicly documented offenders whose cases share similar traits, military-style discipline, violent histories, and a reputation for fearlessness under pressure. According to news archives, Australia has housed several inmates over the decades whose backgrounds or psychological profiles made them uniquely dangerous inside correctional environments. Men who didn't break, men who broke others. The soldier was the kind of inmate who brought tension with him like a shadow. Officers could feel it when they walked past his cell. Fellow inmates avoided speaking his name out loud. He had the rare mix of patience, physical capability, and unpredictability that made him impossible to manage in a standard unit. In one of the cases that inspired his composite character, an inmate with a similar profile took part in orchestrated violence in a different Australian facility, an incident that led to widespread criticism of existing security measures. When men like the soldier entered the system, it exposed the limits of traditional maximum security management tools. Isolation wasn't enough. Observation wasn't enough. Physical barriers weren't enough. If an inmate has the will to wait, to test the system, to study its weaknesses, then time becomes his greatest weapon. And correctional staff learned this the hard way. Public reports document multiple incidents during this era where inmates with high-risk classifications exploited small cracks in prison routines, a moment's distraction during an escort, a pattern in guard rotations, a communication channel left unmonitored. These weren't mistakes. They were opportunities. And it was men like the soldier who took them. By the early 2000s, the pressure was undeniable. New South Wales needed a prison where the most dangerous inmates could be held with zero margin of error. Not low margin. Zero. And so, brick by brick, policy by policy, Goulburn Supermax became real. Fast forward to the present day, and the facility's purpose is unmistakable. According to public corrections records, Goulburn Supermax houses inmates involved in terrorism cases, extremist ideology, organized criminal networks, and violent histories that preclude safe housing elsewhere. But behind each public description are individual human stories, dark, cruel, and devastating, but human nonetheless. These individuals reshaped the prison. Their crimes reshaped public policy. Their behavior reshaped daily routines for every officer who steps inside. To understand those changes, you have to step into one particular morning in Goulburn Supermax, a morning involving a man we'll call the preacher. Unlike Daniel from Chapter 1, whose influence relied on criminal networks, the preacher's power came from ideology. Australia has held several extremist offenders in recent years, all documented in court filings, national security updates, and news reports. These individuals often require strict isolation not just because of personal risk, but because of their ability to radicalize others. The preacher represents this category, a composite based on publicly known cases involving prisoners whose ideological influence presented ongoing security concerns. When he entered Goulburn, the system responded like it was handling radioactive material. Not out of fear. Out of protocol. Every extremist inmate presents two threats, according to counterterrorism analysts quoted in Australian media. The threat of their actions. And the threat of their words. You can secure actions with concrete and handcuffs. Words. Those travel differently. That's why communication restrictions in Goulburn are so absolute. Phone calls are monitored. Visits are non-contact. Mail goes through a filter so rigorous that some letters never leave the building. It's not censorship. It's containment. A necessary one, corrections officials argue in public statements. The preacher understood this. He used every permitted channel with surgical precision. Every allowed call was an attempt to push boundaries. Every letter was a test of the system's vigilance. And yet the walls didn't move. That's the difference between a normal maximum security prison and a supermax. Normal maximums bend. Supermaxes do not. But rigidity comes with consequences. Isolation takes a toll, on inmates and officers alike. This is where the ethical debate begins. Psychologists, advocates, and human rights groups, referencing international guidelines and medical research, have repeatedly raised concerns about long-term solitary confinement. They argue that it can erode mental health, distort perception, intensify paranoia. That some men who enter Goulburn Supermax angry, leave it broken. Others disagree. Corrections officials, staff unions, and victims' families argue that the individuals housed there have committed crimes or posed risks so extreme that isolation is the only responsible option. No one wins that argument. It is simply the price of a system built to contain the uncontrollable. Now shift the lens 700 kilometers south, to Victoria. Where Goulburn's story is shaped by isolation and extremism, Barwon Prison is shaped by organized crime. You can't tell Barwon's history without mentioning the words, gangland era, a period extensively documented in investigations, documentaries, court records, and media coverage. Throughout the early 2000s, Melbourne saw a series of gangland killings that consumed headlines and reshaped public perception of organized crime. The cases involved high-profile individuals, complex criminal enterprises, and a level of violence that shocked the country. Several of the offenders from that era eventually passed through Barwon's gates. Some are still there. One of them forms the basis of our next composite character, the accountant. Unlike the violent street-level enforcers or high-profile figures whose names made headlines, the accountant was a strategist. A thinker. Someone who handled logistics, finances, and information. Public records from similar cases describe individuals whose roles were less visible, but equally critical to the machinery of organized crime. The accountant wasn't feared because of physical intimidation. He was feared because he knew too much. And in Barwon Prison, knowledge is a currency far more dangerous than a homemade weapon. Barwon has long been home to inmates with deep ties to criminal networks. According to investigative reports, some of these individuals coordinate or attempt to coordinate activities outside the prison walls, even from within high-security units. This is why Barwon's communication monitoring is so extensive. Why visits are restricted. Why phone calls can be cut without warning. Why inmate movements are mapped as carefully as troop formations. But unlike Goulburn, Barwon doesn't rely on severe isolation as its primary tool. It relies on intelligence. Intel from officers. Intel from surveillance. Intel from intercepted messages. Because in Barwon, influence doesn't disappear in a cell. It mutates. It goes underground. It becomes a whisper through the slot of a door. It becomes a coded request in a seemingly innocent phone call. It becomes silence at the wrong moment. And officers know it. One former staff member, speaking to the media years ago, described it bluntly. In Barwon, you don't assume. You verify. Every time. But Barwon's story, its transformation into a fortress, didn't happen quietly. It was shaped by incidents the public still remembers. Incidents that made headlines. Incidents that forced immediate reform. One well-known example from public reporting involves a violent clash inside the prison that required emergency intervention from specialized units. Another involved an escape plot that was intercepted after a coded message was detected in mail screening. And another incident, widely covered by the media, led to temporary lockdowns across multiple units after officers intercepted intelligence about a planned attack. Incidents like these didn't just change policy. They hardened Barwon's identity. They turned it from a high-security facility into a symbol, a visible reminder of Australia's criminal history and the costs required to contain it. But symbols have weight. And part of that weight comes from the men who push against the system, testing boundaries, provoking responses, and forcing corrections officials to adapt. Our next composite character represents that pressure, the architect. The architect is based on several publicly documented cases of inmates known for their ability to coordinate operations even under heavy surveillance. He wasn't violent by nature. He was calculating. He understood systems. He understood people. He understood incentives. In another era, he might have been a corporate strategist or a political operator. Instead, he became a centerpiece in multiple criminal investigations. When the architect entered Barwon, the staff already knew who he was. They had read the files. They had seen the intelligence reports. They had studied his communications patterns. And yet, he still found ways to test them. According to a heavily covered public case that inspired part of his profile, certain inmates in high-security facilities have attempted to use coded phrases, legal correspondence, or even artwork to transmit messages outside the walls. The architect excelled at that. Every officer who dealt with him described the same unnerving feeling. He's already thought this through before you have. That is the kind of inmate who shapes security protocols. Not through violence, but through intelligence. Because if a prison is a fortress, then the mind of a man like the architect is a siege engine. One capable of prying open weaknesses no one else can see. By now you might be thinking that Goulburn and Barwon are built entirely around the worst offenders. But the truth is more complicated. Not every inmate in these prisons is a monster. Not every inmate is a mastermind. Some are simply men whose crimes were catastrophic, violent, or unpredictable, men whose psychological profiles or histories of aggression made them incompatible with general population. One such man, whose composite identity we'll call the drifter, represents a category of offenders who move between facilities due to unpredictable behavior. According to public corrections data, individuals like this often struggle with mental health issues, trauma, or histories of explosive violence. The drifter had no network, no ideology, no plan. What he had was chaos. In one of the real-life cases that influenced this composite, an inmate with a similar profile attacked an officer without warning, leading to permanent disability. In another documented case, an inmate stabbed another prisoner after a minor disagreement, triggering intense review of unit placement policies. Men like the drifter are the embodiment of unpredictability. And unpredictability is a kind of danger no prison is fully prepared for. This is why both Goulburn and Barwon rely heavily on classification reviews, psychological evaluations, and risk assessments. Some inmates are dangerous because they plan. Others are dangerous because they don't. And the system has to manage both. But vulnerable inmates also enter these walls. Inmates who become targets. Inmates placed into protection units, not because they pose a danger, but because the danger is all around them. Barwon, in particular, is known for its protection units. Public reports describe how certain offenders, especially those convicted of crimes that other inmates despise, require near total separation for their own safety. These individuals do not shape prison policy through violence or influence. They shape it through vulnerability. Their presence forces staff to double their vigilance, triple their oversight, and monitor threats like live wires. It is a reminder that maximum security prisons are not simply houses of violence. They are ecosystems, fragile, combustible, and constantly evolving. And every inmate, dangerous or vulnerable, contributes to that ecosystem. So what do these stories tell us? What do the mastermind, the soldier, the preacher, the accountant, the architect, and the drifter, all composites drawn from decades of real public cases, teach us about these prisons? One lesson. One truth. One undeniable reality. No prison becomes the most secure because of its walls. It becomes secure because of the men it was built to contain. Goulburn Supermax is not extreme because its designers wanted extremity. Barwon is not fortified because architects liked heavy concrete. These places are shaped by necessity. By survival. By history. Because every time an inmate outwits a guard, the system must evolve. Every time a criminal syndicate reaches inside a prison, security must tighten. Every time violence erupts, a new protocol is born. Maximum security prisons are not monuments of punishment. They are monuments of adaptation. And Chapter 3 will take us deeper inside that adaptation. Inside the daily life, the surveillance, the internal cultures, the power dynamics, and the invisible wars that shape each day behind the razor wire. Inside the tension that never sleeps. Inside the rhythms of confinement that can break a human mind, or forge one. Inside the truth of what it means to survive Australia's most secure prisons. Whether you're an inmate, or the officer sworn to watch him. Life inside the fortress. If you stand in the center of Australia's two most secure prisons, Goulburn Supermax in New South Wales and Barwon Prison in Victoria, you will feel something you cannot find anywhere else in the country. A stillness. Not peace, never peace. A controlled, engineered stillness. The kind of quiet that survives only because everything inside these walls is constantly monitored, measured, and pre-planned down to the minute. Inside these facilities, chaos is the enemy. Unpredictability is danger. Silence is the only space where order survives. But silence also hides the truth. Because behind locked steel doors and fortified corridors, these prisons are alive with their own invisible rhythms, routines that shape the lives of inmates and correctional officers alike. Rhythms built from fear, respect, survival, and the constant awareness that every moment could be the one when pressure erupts. This is the reality of daily life inside Australia's most secure prisons. And as you'll see, survival has very different meanings depending on which side of the bars you stand. We begin at Goulburn Supermax, just after 5 a.m. The sun hasn't risen yet, and the outside world is still asleep. But inside the Supermax wing, the fluorescent lights flicker on automatically, casting a cold, clinical glow across the corridor. Sound doesn't travel far here. That's by design. Every wall, every vent, every ceiling panel has been engineered to prevent inmates from communicating with each other. According to Australia's publicly available correctional design criteria, the Supermax's architecture is intentionally segmented, sealed airflows, reinforced concrete barriers, isolation chambers that act like soundproof boxes. This is a prison where you could scream, and the men next door might never hear you. That's the point. Inside cell 14 sits Daniel, the composite inmate introduced in Chapter 1, the man whose influence once stretched across criminal networks, who walked into Supermax with the calm confidence of someone used to controlling the room. He no longer controls anything. Not even his mornings. Everything inside Supermax is dictated by routine. A routine crafted not for convenience, but for containment. First comes the lights. Then the intercom buzz. Then the metallic click of central control unlocking the food slot. A tray slides through, a meal designed to minimize risk. No metal cutlery. No removable parts. Nothing that could be sharpened or hidden. Daniel eats in silence. If he wants to speak, he speaks to the camera. If he wants to move, he presses a button and waits. If he wants to breathe outdoor air, he waits for his scheduled yard time, alone, always alone. Supermax creates solitude so total that inmates often lose track of time. Days blur. Weeks blend. Reality becomes a looping corridor of identical hours. Psychologists have written extensively about the effects of long-term isolation. Publicly available research shows that sensory deprivation and lack of human contact can distort memory, induce paranoia, and create emotional instability. That concern echoes in international guidelines, including the United Nations Mandela Rules, which classify prolonged solitary confinement as a practice with severe psychological consequences. And yet, for corrections officials in Australia, Supermax isn't about punishment. It's about containment. The men housed here, whether for terrorism-related offenses, violent crimes, or high-risk behavioral histories, are considered too dangerous or influential to mix with anyone else. The officers know it. The inmates know it. And the walls enforce it. If you follow the corridor toward the exercise yards, you'll see what inmates call the box, a concrete courtyard with a mesh overhead fence that allows sunlight but nothing else. Each inmate gets between 1 and 2 hours a day here, depending on classification. No physical contact with other prisoners. No shared equipment. No conversation through fences. That's where we find the preacher, the composite extremist whose ideology once threatened to seep through cracks in the system. His influence is the reason Supermax operates with such rigid communication restrictions. According to multiple public court cases, certain extremist inmates in Australia have attempted to use coded messages, family visits, or legal privileges to maintain networks outside. The preacher walks in slow circles around the yard. No expression. No stimulation except sky and concrete. Sometimes he mutters to himself. Sometimes he quotes scripture. Sometimes he simply stands still, as though absorbing something invisible. But no matter what he's doing, 2 officers watch him from behind shatterproof reinforced glass. Their presence is constant. Their vigilance never fades. In Supermax, officers must treat every inmate, even silent ones, as an active threat. According to NSW correctional training protocols, staff assigned to high-risk units receive specialized instruction on dealing with violent offenders, extremists, and individuals capable of manipulation or coordinated action. People imagine that being a guard in a maximum security prison means breaking up fights. In Supermax, the job is preventing the fight from ever happening. And that kind of prevention, hour after hour, day after day, takes its own toll. Shift the lens now, hundreds of kilometers away, to Victoria. Barwon Prison. If Supermax is monastic isolation, Barwon is tension held in suspension, an environment where inmates interact, observe each other, trade glances and rumors, and create the kind of volatile ecosystem that feels like a city compressed into concrete. Barwon wakes up differently. Less silently. Less predictably. At 6 a.m., the main units hum to life with a mix of clanging metal, voices shouting through doors, and officers preparing for the morning unlock. Not all inmates are unlocked at once. Barwon operates under staggered routines, with high-risk units like Unit 13 receiving additional security checks. Inside one of those units sits the accountant, the composite strategist whose mind is as dangerous as any weapon. He wakes early, because in Barwon, information moves fast, and anyone who sleeps late risks missing the cues that determine survival. Barwon is not the same as Supermax. Inmates talk here. They see each other. They measure each other. Power is fluid. Alliances shift. Every glance matters. According to public correctional accounts, Barwon houses inmates connected to organized criminal groups, violent offenders, and individuals whose cases have been splashed across national headlines. Some of them still have influence. Some still have loyalties outside. And some, like the accountant, know how to read people with unnerving accuracy. When the officer makes his first pass, the accountant is already standing near the door, waiting for the brief glimpse through the window slot. He doesn't speak, doesn't gesture. But he watches. Always watching. Because in Barwon, the man who understands the unit understands the game. This is a place where a simple disagreement can become a chain reaction. A single insult can split a unit in two. A whispered rumor can turn a quiet afternoon into a lockdown. Officers know this. It's why Barwon relies heavily on intelligence gathering. Public reports describe how information from phone monitoring, mail screening, CCTV observation, and behavioral tracking forms the backbone of Barwon's control strategies. Intel officers analyze patterns the way detectives analyze case files. But inmates analyze patterns too. And sometimes, they see things staff do not. That's what makes Barwon dangerous, not just the offenders themselves, but the psychology of the environment. It is a powder keg that must be kept eternally defused. By 9 a.m., Goulburn and Barwon are both fully operational, but their energies couldn't be more different. In Goulburn Supermax, the corridors remain silent. Officers move in pairs, speaking in low voices, double-checking each door, each panel, each camera feed. Routine is survival. Precision is safety. In Barwon, the atmosphere sharpens as the day unfolds. Voices rise. Unit dynamics shift. Tensions simmer beneath the surface of routine. To illustrate how different these worlds are, consider this moment inside Barwon's protection unit, a section reserved for inmates who cannot safely mix with general population. Inside lives the drifter, the composite unstable inmate introduced earlier. He paces his cell, muttering softly. His mind is a shifting landscape, unpredictable, volatile. Officers know not to turn their backs on him, not because he's connected to any network, but because he can explode without warning. One moment calm. The next moment chaos. Public records detail numerous cases of inmates with similar profiles causing sudden violent incidents inside Australian prisons, attacking staff, striking other inmates, or attempting self-harm without discernible provocation. Protection units are not peaceful. They are pressure chambers. Some inmates fear others. Some fear themselves. Some weaponize their vulnerability to manipulate staff. And staff must navigate all of it with nothing but training, instinct, and caution. That's the invisible reality the public rarely sees. The officers aren't just guards. They are negotiators, strategists, mental health responders, intelligence gatherers, crisis managers. And they do this work in a place where a moment's hesitation can get someone injured, or worse. Move back to Goulburn. This is where the contrast becomes startling. Inside Supermax, violence is rare, not because inmates are less dangerous, but because they lack the opportunity. You cannot stab another inmate if you never see another inmate. You cannot start a riot if you never enter a shared yard. You cannot form alliances if you live in solitary confinement. But violence can still occur. Against officers. Against property. Against the self. One particularly haunting moment unfolds in the cell of the preacher around early afternoon. He sits cross-legged on the floor, staring at a point on the wall. He's been doing it for hours, speaking quietly to someone who is not there. This behavior is not unique. Publicly available research on solitary confinement documents cases where inmates begin to hallucinate auditory or visual phenomena after prolonged isolation. An officer watches the preacher through the camera feed. His voice crackles over the intercom. Are you all right? No answer. Do you need medical help? Still silence. This is where Supermax becomes a psychological labyrinth, for inmates and staff alike. Officers must decide whether silence is a symptom or a strategy. Is the inmate dissociating? Is he manipulating? Is he preparing for something? Every possibility carries consequences. And every decision they make is scrutinized. Now follow another thread, one that runs through both prisons. Control. Everything in these facilities hinges on control. Who has it? Who wants it? Who's losing it? In Goulburn Supermax, the institution has total control over physical space. But inmates seek control through mental endurance, manipulation of routine, or legal maneuvering. Daniel, for example, has been filing grievances. The system allows this. Legally and ethically, inmates have the right to challenge conditions or report concerns. But grievances can serve multiple purposes. Some inmates use them to provoke staff. Some use them to test responses. Some use them to reassert a sense of power in a powerless environment. Daniel isn't filing out of desperation. He's filing out of strategy. Every rejection teaches him something. Every delay is a data point. Every staff reaction becomes part of a psychological map. This is what makes certain inmates dangerous even in total isolation. Their minds keep moving. Their influence shifts into new forms. And the officers guarding them know that a single overlooked detail, an improperly monitored phone call, a lenient privilege, a poorly interpreted behavior, could have consequences far beyond the cell door. By mid-afternoon, Barwon Prison is entering its most dangerous time of day. This is when tempers run hot. This is when boredom turns aggressive. This is when the unit hierarchy tries to reassert itself. Inside Unit 13, the accountant sits at a table during his limited out-of-cell time. He doesn't talk, but he observes. He listens to conversations between other high-risk inmates. Every prison has storytellers. Barwon's storytellers are dangerous. One inmate brags about a fight from years ago. Another claims he has influence on the outside. Another boasts about money he once laundered. The accountant listens because information is currency. And currency buys survival. In Barwon, strength is not measured in muscle. It's measured in awareness. Who's angry? Who's plotting? Who's afraid? Who's about to snap? Barwon's officers monitor conversations carefully, but with dozens of inmates across multiple units, they can't hear everything. That's where inmates like the accountant become part of the invisible power structure. He knows things. He anticipates things. He senses the rhythm of impending violence before the officers do. And today, he senses something shifting. A new inmate has arrived in the unit, young, nervous, untested. His posture gives him away immediately. Shoulders high. Eyes darting. One hand clenched in a fist he can't relax. He'll be targeted. The accountant knows it. The officers will know it soon. But the difference in timing could mean everything. This is Barwon's daily reality. Violence is not constant. But the threat of violence is. And that threat shapes every decision the officers make, every unlock, every escort, every pat-down, every order given through the power of authority and routine. Back in Goulburn Supermax, the late afternoon hours are quiet. Almost eerily quiet. Inmates return from their isolation yards. Food slots open again. Trays slide through. Guards walk their rounds. Inside cell 14, Daniel sits at his desk, a metal slab bolted to the wall. He writes slowly, methodically, on a sheet of prison-issued paper. What he writes is irrelevant. What matters is why he's writing. Routine keeps the mind anchored. Writing creates structure. Structure creates purpose. Purpose prevents collapse. For some Supermax inmates, writing becomes the only form of communication, the only outlet, the only tether to sanity. Letters are scanned, screened, and sometimes withheld, but the act remains therapeutic. Others reject routine entirely. The preacher, for example, has not touched pen or paper in months. He prefers to speak. He prefers to chant. He prefers to let his mind twist into spaces where logic begins to blur. Some officers fear this. Others pity it. Most simply endure it. Because in Supermax, the emotional cost of the job is enormous. Public corrections reviews have documented high levels of stress, burnout, and trauma among staff who work in high-risk units. They absorb silence. They absorb hostility. They absorb the psychological weight of sitting across from men who may never see freedom again. But they keep going. Because someone has to. As the evening approaches, Barwon begins its lockdown sequence, a complex choreography of doors locking, radios buzzing, keys turning, and officers guiding inmates back to their cells. This is the most dangerous time inside a maximum security prison. Not because inmates have opportunities for violence, those are ending for the day. But because emotions spike when freedom shrinks again. In Unit 13, the young newcomer hesitates before entering his cell. Inmates nearby watch him. Judge him. Calculate him. Fear is a scent here. And he's radiating it. The accountant sees it, and for a moment, their eyes meet. The accountant doesn't smile. Doesn't nod. Doesn't signal. But he knows the newcomer won't last long without protection, real protection, or without making the right alliances. And alliances in Barwon cost something. Everything costs something. The cell doors slam shut. The noise echoes through the unit like thunder. Then silence descends once more. The accountant lies on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, thinking. In a place like Barwon, thinking is survival. Thinking is advantage. Thinking is the difference between controlling your environment and being crushed by it. Meanwhile, at Goulburn Supermax, lockdown barely changes the atmosphere. It's always locked down. After dinner, after checks, after the final routine tasks, the prison settles once more into engineered stillness. Some inmates sleep. Some pace. Some write. Some stare at the ceiling for hours. And then there are those like the preacher. He sits in the corner of his cell, whispering into the air. The camera above him records everything. The officer watching knows he'll whisper for hours. Isolation has become its own religion for him. But even in this silence, even in the most restrictive prison in the country, danger is never far. An officer walking the corridor pauses by one cell. Inside, an inmate is banging his head against the wall, slowly, rhythmically. He does not speak. He does not scream. He simply tries to break something. The wall. His skull. Or the invisible cage inside his mind. This is why high-security prisons require psychological services. Why staff undergo crisis intervention training. Why every officer carries not just tools, but empathy hardened into professional detachment. Because these places are not simply cages, they are human pressure chambers. And human beings break in different ways. By midnight, both prisons fall into their strangest hours. The hours when nothing happens. And yet everything is happening beneath the surface. This is when Supermax inmates lie awake, their minds racing through memories they cannot escape. This is when Barwon inmates whisper through vents or plot moves that won't come into play for weeks. This is when officers fight exhaustion, knowing a single lapse could have consequences. This is when time stretches into something elastic, something warped, something difficult to measure. This is when both prisons feel more like psychological experiments than institutions. And this is when survival stops being about muscles or reputation. And becomes about endurance. Mental endurance. Emotional endurance. Endurance of isolation, fear, boredom, and the crushing weight of routine. This is daily life in Australia's most secure prisons. Not the glamorous violence people imagine. Not the edge-of-your-seat chaos seen in movies. Just pressure. Constant pressure. Slow, heavy, unrelenting pressure. On the inmates. On the officers. On the system itself. But beneath that pressure lies a question, one that Australia continues to debate. Do these prisons protect society? Or do they reveal something darker about the society that built them? When the walls speak. You can build the strongest walls in a nation. You can fortify doors with steel, embed floors with sensors, seal air vents, and design routines so rigid that not even a gust of wind can move through them without being monitored. You can spend millions creating the perfect system of containment. But in the end, a prison, no matter how secure, is not a machine. It's a pressure cooker. And pressure always finds a weak point. Goulburn Supermax and Barwon Prison were built to eliminate unpredictability. To neutralize chaos. To ensure the men inside cannot shape the world outside. But in reality, both institutions have faced cracks, subtle, dramatic, human cracks, revealing truths that governments rarely admit and the public barely understands. This final chapter is not about what the prisons are. It's about what they cost. Politically. Socially. Morally. Psychologically. It's about the moments when the walls speak back. And what those moments say about the limits of control. We begin where the pressure is highest. Goulburn Supermax. Inside this facility, every hour is engineered, every sound is monitored, every movement is restricted beyond ordinary comprehension. Yet even in a place designed to remove power from the dangerous, some inmates find ways to reclaim it. Not with weapons. Not with violence. With presence. One such presence is the preacher, the composite extremist introduced earlier. His voice once echoed through ideological networks outside. And even though he now sits locked in a cell, isolated, watched, and cut off from contact, the system still fears him. Not for what he might do, but for what he might inspire. Australia's most secure prisons have long struggled with the paradox of extremist inmates. According to corrections research and public inquiries, extremist ideology can survive even inside isolation units. It can spread through letters, phone calls, legal interactions, or coded phrasing. And so, every letter the preacher writes is screened. Every call is monitored. Every movement is logged. Still, he remains unpredictable. Late one night, long after lights out, a strange noise echoes through his cell. Officers watching the cameras see him kneeling on the floor, both hands pressed against the cold concrete, whispering rapidly. At first, they think he's chanting. But as the audio feed enhances the sound, it becomes clear. He's arguing. With someone who isn't there. This is the psychological coefficient of extreme isolation, something documented by medical professionals and human rights groups around the world. Paranoia. Dissociation. Hallucinations. The walls are doing their job. But they are doing it brutally. An officer radios the supervisor. He's talking to the wall again. A pause. Then the reply. Log it. Keep eyes on him. No intervention. No break in routine. Because in Supermax, psychological decline is not an emergency. It's an expectation. If the Goulburn experience represents the crushing weight of silence, Barwon Prison represents the echo chamber of conflict, the constant hum of tension that never fully disappears. Inside Barwon, evenings are when the prison becomes most honest. Dinner trays are collected. Doors slam shut. Officers double-check locks. And then the unit falls into a low, simmering quiet. Not silent. Not calm. Just waiting. Because Barwon's walls have witnessed violence, riots, plots, and high-profile crises, some widely reported, others buried in internal reviews. And the older inmates remember all of it. Inside the high-security unit, the accountant sits on his bunk, listening to the faint noises drifting through the corridor. He's been in Barwon long enough to know that every night has a signature sound. Some nights are tense. Some restless. Some deceptively calm. Tonight's sound is different. Sharp. Unsteady. Like something shifting under the usual rhythm. It's coming from the cell of the young newcomer, the one who arrived in Chapter 3. Officers noticed his distress at lockdown. Other inmates noticed it too. Fear in prison is like blood in shark-infested water. The accountant knows this. And he knows what fear attracts. It attracts opportunists. Predators. Men who want leverage. Men who want followers. Men who want entertainment. Barwon's ecosystem thrives on hierarchy. Someone rises. Someone falls. It never stops. Meanwhile, Goulburn Supermax is beginning its nightly welfare round, a monitoring protocol repeated every few hours. Officers walk the corridor with the quiet efficiency of surgeons, stopping at each cell window to confirm that an inmate is breathing, conscious, and physically unharmed. Inside cell 14, Daniel sits at his desk with papers spread out in front of him. He's writing again. Every so often, he glances toward the camera, a small gesture, subtle but deliberate. He wants the officers to know he's working on something. Not an escape plan. Not a message to associates. A legal appeal. This is where the ethics of extreme security incarceration grow complicated. For some inmates, appeals are legitimate. For others, they are a chessboard, one of the very few arenas where they can reclaim agency. Appeals can create pressure. Delay transfers. Secure meetings with legal teams. Trigger procedural reviews. Force the system to acknowledge them. Even in silence, Daniel tries to exert influence. The officer watching him has seen this behavior before. Filing appeal after appeal. Requesting documents. Signing forms. Writing letters. It's not communication. It's resistance. And resistance, no matter how small, can destabilize the emotional equilibrium Supermax tries to enforce. In Barwon, that equilibrium is even more fragile. A correctional officer named Officer Hale, a pseudonym based on common staff profiles, begins the nighttime pass through Unit 13. He's experienced. Calm. Alert. The kind of officer who was built for high-risk units. As he approaches the newcomer's cell, he hears something. A low trembling sound. Breathing, uneven and quick. He opens the viewing slot. The newcomer is sitting on his bed, shaking violently, hands in his hair. What's going on? Hale asks softly. The young man jerks his head toward the wall. They told me, he whispers. They told me I was done. Who? He points vaguely toward the cells across the corridor. No names. No details. Just fear. Hale knows what's happening. Someone threatened him. Or implied something. Or stared at him too long. Sometimes intimidation doesn't require words. He radios the unit supervisor. We've got an at-risk inmate. Possible threat from others. The supervisor's response is low and tight. Move slow. Don't escalate. Because escalation is a grenade here. One wrong step could trigger a unit lockdown. Or spark retaliation. Or expose a confrontation that officers aren't prepared to contain. Hale tries to calm the young man. You're safe for now. Stay focused on your breathing. But he knows safety is relative. Barwon keeps inmates alive. It does not keep them unafraid. Back in Goulburn, the night deepens. Supermax becomes a world of cameras. Officers don't walk continuously, they watch. Screens glow in the control room. Movement in any cell triggers surveillance protocols. In cell 22, the preacher is still awake. He's writing now, not chanting. His handwriting is erratic, looping over the page. The words might be scripture, or they might be something else. The officer zooms in through the camera. It's neither. The preacher is writing the same sentence over and over again. The walls listen. 10 times. 20. 50. The officer shifts uncomfortably. Another staff member glances at the screen. He's spiraling. Document it, the supervisor says. Should we call psych? Document it. Because in Supermax, psychological collapse is not an emergency. Unless it becomes a threat. And that line, between suffering and dangerousness, is nearly impossible to measure in real time. Barwon Prison, midnight. The accountant is still awake. Eyes open. Listening. This is when information moves most easily. The vents. The walls. The subtle knocks inmates use to signal each other. Zeros and ones. Small taps. Patterns. Officers know about vent communication. In fact, public reviews document how Barwon has attempted to interrupt such methods through structural updates and monitoring. But you cannot silence every pathway in a system built on human creativity. Tonight, the accountant hears 3 taps. A pause. Then 2 taps. A code. A message. Not for him, but he hears it anyway. He decodes it automatically. Move tomorrow. Move what? Who? Why? In Barwon, the content of the message matters less than the fact that a message exists. Movement implies intention. Intention implies organization. Organization implies trouble. The accountant sits up slowly. Someone is planning something. But he doesn't know if it's a fight, a smuggling attempt, a manipulation strategy, or something else entirely. And what he doesn't know The officers definitely don't know. Which means tomorrow will be dangerous. By dawn, both prisons wake to the same instinct. Tension. Officers feel it first. Veterans sense it before the first unlock. Even the cameras seem to capture a different energy. Goulburn Supermax begins its morning routine, sterile, controlled, emotionless. Barwon begins its morning like a fuse being lit. Inside Goulburn, Daniel is pacing. Not calmly. Not methodically. Pacing with purpose. He's waiting. For what, the officers don't know. But pacing in a Supermax cell is communication. It means pressure is building. In Barwon, the young newcomer refuses breakfast. He's trembling. Eyes red. Hands shaking. Officer Hale approaches, concerned but cautious. You need to eat. I'm dead today, the young man whispers. I know it. No, you're not. They said I was. Hale stiffens. The supervisor arrives, tension radiating off him. We're doing a targeted cell search. Something's moving in this unit. The accountant overhears the announcement during his breakfast distribution. He lowers his gaze. This means his decoded message was real. Someone is planning something. But Barwon is not the kind of place where plans remain small. Plans snowball. Plans spread. Plans morph. What starts as a threat to one inmate can become a threat to the entire unit. Or to staff. Or to the prison's stability. Meanwhile, in Goulburn Supermax, the preacher has stopped writing. He's standing in the center of his cell, arms lifted, face tilted toward the ceiling. His lips move silently. The officer watching can't determine if he's praying or plotting or losing grip on reality entirely. Then suddenly, violently, the preacher slams his palms against the wall. The impact reverberates through the cameras. Another slam. Another. Another. An alarm triggers. Officers spring into response mode. But Supermax protocols are strict. They don't rush in. They assess. They watch. They decide. Because entering a Supermax cell is extremely dangerous. An inmate who appears unstable may be luring officers. Using psychological disturbance as bait. Waiting for the perfect moment. The preacher continues pounding, whispering between each blow. The walls listen, the walls listen. He's trying to break something, physically or mentally. And for the first time in days, the officers feel uncertain. This is what extreme isolation does. Not always immediately. Not always visibly. But inevitably. Even the strongest mind bends eventually. The officer radios central control. We need intervention. Silence. Then a response. Hold position. Hold. In a moment where any other institution might intervene, Supermax waits. Because in this world, restraint is safer than action. Barwon Prison does not have the luxury of waiting. Officers assemble in the Unit 13 corridor for the targeted cell search. Hale stands ready. His pulse steady but higher than usual. The first cell, clear. Second cell, clear. Third, a small stash of unauthorized items, useless, low-level contraband. Nothing that matches the coded message. They move to the newcomer's cell. He's curled up on his bed, trembling. But there's nothing in the room, no weapon, no notes, nothing that suggests he's part of the plan. The supervisor grows tense. We're missing something. That's when a shout breaks the air. 2 cells down. A commotion. An officer calls for backup. Unit 13 erupts. It's not a riot. Not an attack. Not an escape attempt. It's a distraction. 2 inmates staged a loud confrontation to pull officers away from another cell elsewhere in the unit. Hale realizes it instantly. It's a diversion. They sprint toward the far end of the corridor. Inside cell 47, the door is still locked. But the inmate inside, a known organizer linked to the architect's composite profile, is standing over his sink with something in his hand. A sharpened piece of plastic. Melted. Filed. Hardened. A homemade weapon. Officers yell commands. Alarms sound. Backup floods the unit. The weapon clatters to the floor. The inmate smirks. He'd never planned to use it today. He just wanted to see how close he could get. He wanted to measure staff response times. Observe procedure. Test vulnerabilities. This was reconnaissance. And in a prison like Barwon, reconnaissance is the first step towards something much bigger. The unit goes into full lockdown. The accountant returns to his cell. He lies back. Breathes out. Chaos was contained today. But only because someone listened at the right time. Only because the pressure was managed. Only because every officer stayed sharp. Tomorrow, the cycle starts again. Back in Goulburn, crisis intervention officers gather outside the preacher's cell. They've been monitoring him for nearly an hour. He's stopped pounding. He's sitting on the floor again. Head down. Hands limp. A psychologist is called. A medical officer arrives. The team prepares for controlled entry. This is rare in Supermax. Entering a cell requires layers of authorization. When the door finally opens, the preacher doesn't resist. He doesn't speak. He doesn't look at anyone. He's carried out, placed under psychiatric observation, and the cell is left empty. For now. But the echo of his behavior lingers. The walls listened. Now the staff must decide what the walls heard. And what the walls will become. Both prisons experience deep stillness in the aftermath. Not peace. But the silence that follows a held breath. Officers regroup. Supervisors write reports. Inmates return to routine. The facility returns to order. But beneath that order, a deeper truth emerges. The walls do not protect people from danger. They protect society from the men who force society to build such walls in the first place. And the cost of that protection is immense. Isolation that fragments minds. Violence that simmers beneath control. Staff who absorb trauma like a second skin. Systems that walk the razor's edge between safety and cruelty. Goulburn Supermax and Barwon Prison are not symbols of failure. They are symbols of necessity. Australia built these fortresses not because it wanted to, but because it had to. To contain influence. To neutralize violence. To manage unpredictability. To keep the public safe. But as long as these prisons exist, they raise a question that has no easy answer. How far should a society go to contain its most dangerous people? Before the containment itself becomes its own kind of danger. In the end, the walls speak. Not loudly. Not clearly. But they speak. And what they say is this. Control is never absolute. Safety is never guaranteed. Order is never permanent. The walls can hold men. But they cannot hold history. And everything that created these prisons. Every crime, every fear, every act of violence. Echoes endlessly inside them. Even when the world outside forgets.